she lifted her glass, smiled across the table, and said it like it was the nicest thing in the world. We decided to take care of the family finances. We even canceled your card. The room erupted in polite applause. Linen napkins fluttered. Someone laughed too loud to fill the silence, and I felt my smile stay on my face like a mask nailed into place. I put my napkin on my lap. I put my hand on the edge of the table. Then I looked at my son and asked one small question that made the sound in the room stop altogether. "You really don't know, do you?" For a moment, Rodrigo froze as if someone had pressed pause on his life. The fork in his hand made a tiny clink against his plate. It was the kind of sound that sounds like an accusation. If you like honest, messy stories, if you want to hear the whole thing, stay with me. And if you want more confessions like this, subscribe. I tell this now because the memory still lives under my skin. The smell of cinnamon from the tamales, the glass that Valeria raised high enough to catch the chandelier light, the way my grandson Mateo's cheek was pink from the cold outside. But I need you to let me step back with me, because nothing here is a single moment. It was a knot tied over 30 years and pulled tight one Christmas night. When Javier died, I was 28, with a belly full of our son and a small house that didn't even cover the bills. There are photographs of me from those months. Hair knotted up, a dress with patches, hands raw from thread and fabric. I remember thinking, with that stubborn kind of hunger that gets you up early and keeps you awake late, that whatever I built would have to hold Rodrigo and me. There was no one to bail us out. There was only the Singer's sewing machine my mother left me, and a neighbor who knew how to sew hems faster than a hummingbird. I apprenticed myself to Doña Estela because I didn't have the fancy schooling or the right introductions, but I had time and a willingness to learn. She taught me how to measure not just for fitting, but for profit, how to buy cloth by the bolt, how to ask for a discount without losing your dignity, how to turn small orders into steady work. We sat on borrowed stools, coffee cooling in chipped cups, and she told me stories of her early years in the market, the way a woman can save a peso here and there, and one day wake up with a little house and a rooster in the yard. The first time I felt like I could breathe was the morning I took a sum of bills folded under my pillow and bought a corner of a lot in a neighborhood that nobody would call glamour. I paid in cash, counting the soles of my fingers like a miser counting coins. To Rodrigo, I showed the same face he'd always known, careful, cheerful, proud without spectacle. To the world, I still wore the same faded shawl, my rebozo, because my plan was never about boasting. I wanted him to know hunger as a tool, not a chain. I wanted him to learn to put his own hands to work. That choice, the choice to hide some things, was born of a very particular kind of love. There is a difference between keeping someone safe and spoon-feeding them until their arms forget how to lift. I believed then, with the simplicity of a woman who had nothing to lose, that the best gift I could give Rodrigo was the chance to build the life he would one day inherit. I wanted him to have the habit of work, the pride of paying a bill, the bone-deep knowledge that he could provide. So I kept my ledger close. I paid taxes quietly, bought a small duplex, then a shop front across the street where I made blouses and mended uniforms. I met more people, suppliers, an accountant who would later be my lawyer, and I watched money become something steady, not magic. There were nights when I questioned myself. I sat by a window with the sewing machine silent, and I would hold Rodrigo as he slept and think, am I teaching him or abandoning him? But I remembered the day he paid for his first textbook with money he'd earned after a summer internship. The light in his face made me think I had done the right thing. I thought, discipline is love with edges. Years passed. The shop became a small business. The small business hired women who were like me,
widows, single mothers, with tired hands and bright ideas. I taught them what Doña Estela taught me, how to bargain without losing your dignity, how to save a little, how to reinvest the profit. A year after another, a rental unit here, a small lot there, titles kept in a safe. I put the papers in a lawyer's envelope and told myself stories to keep from feeling guilty. This will be Rodrigo's inheritance. This will be for Mateo when he is born. This will ensure no one will ever push him out of a house he thinks he owns. Then along came Valeria, with her shoes that clicked and a laugh that seemed practiced to slip into rooms. She had a resume that liked to be seen. She knew the right restaurants, had an elevator pitch when she met my neighbors, and a phone that hummed with appointments. At first, she was a bright guest at dinner, bringing a bottle of wine and a dessert that looked like a photograph. I warmed to her. Why wouldn't I? My son smiled in a new way when he looked at her. He carried himself differently. He came home with flowers sometimes, and the house, which had felt too large for two, suddenly felt full. It was easy to conflate her success with goodness. That's one of the dangerous human things to do, assume how someone will act by their shoes. The first small things were easy to miss. She began to compliment the way I peeled onions with a small, patronizing curiosity. She started to call my patchwork curtains charming, but in a tone that made me feel like a stage prop. She asked if she could help me with the social media page for the shop. Modernize, she said. She started suggesting that small changes would be better for the family. Rodrigo loved her earnestness. He loved how she took charge.
When she said, "Let me handle this," he would relax as if the world had become a problem with a solution. She offered to make appointments for him, to bring a friend who could help with resumes. That first winter, she came early to tell me how she thought we could optimize our expenses. She used the word like a prayer, optimize, optimize, optimize. I remember feeling a small prickle of something like caution, but I smiled and let her fold a napkin the right way. She moved into our lives as fog moves in on a summer evening, quiet, inevitable. She was clever with boundaries. She respected my space at first, then slowly blurred it. She would call in the evenings with simple questions about a bill or a refrigerator model or whether we had an extra credit card available. Just in case, she would say. The tamales incident was the first time it went beyond polite boundary crossing. It was a Sunday in December, a cooking day. I had been making tamales since before Rodrigo was born. Corn masa under my nails, the smell of lard and roasted chile and black pepper. I remember the kitchen felt like the inside of a chapter, the table sticky with masa, the radio playing boleros low. I made a big pot of mole, the sauce simmering until the room smelled like history. Valeria arrived in a sleek coat and looked at the tamales the way some people look at a relic in a museum. "Are you sure you want to serve those?" she asked my sister-in-law, loud enough for the whole kitchen to hear. "They're rustic." The word rustic fell like an insult. My sister-in-law glanced at me. My hands did not stop moving because the tamales had to be wrapped and someone had to finish. Later, in the dining room, a cousin asked if she should bring anything to a dinner where everyone would eat something lighter. Valeria suggested we send a plate to a neighbor who's trying to be healthy. It was minor, petty, but it was a lesson. Valeria had a way of saying a thing that made everyone else rearrange how they saw it. From that day, small exclusions multiplied. Invitations came with conditions. If you can make it after 6, if you can come without helping with the children. Little talks that edged me out. She started to question my memory in front of others. "Emilia, are you sure you didn't already pay that?" It was subtle, delivered like a helpful correction, but what it did was change the language of the room. People began to frame me in the past tense. "Oh, Emilia used to do that." The present took a step back.
There were more practical moves. She began to suggest consolidating accounts, moving bank branches, signing authority for small things, just so we can keep everything organized. She clung to the word help like a cloak. She asked Rodrigo to sign a document, just a power so I can pay the utilities if we're ever in a rush. He signed it. He wanted to be the man who could trust his wife. He wanted to be helpful. He trusted her the way sons trust who they love.
I remember seeing the form months later in a pile of bills, faint blue ink on a photocopy. It said things about being allowed to manage payments and make decisions. I did not shout. It would have been spectacle. I burned the page instead in the kitchen sink. But burning a paper does not burn the idea. The small dominions she set up, control of the calendar, the dentist appointments, the car keys, soon expanded. She arranged the house, moved things to improve traffic, and told guests where to sit as if she were rehearsing an audience for her performance. People began to turn to her for explanations about me. Oh, my mother-in-law, she prefers things a different way. And the way she said it made the furniture of our home feel like a museum piece, admired, curated, untouchable. Perhaps the worst was the way she made Rodrigo doubt himself. She would mention my forgetfulness as though it were a symptom of something I could not fix. When he called me to ask about a utility bill, she would answer for me before I did. He began to apologize to her, and I began to watch him shrink like a man who was learning to take less space in his own life. I tried small counter-moves. I invited other relatives over, held a sewing afternoon, made sure Rodrigo had lunch at my place sometimes. I brought out old photo albums and told stories about Javier, about his crooked ways of tying shoelaces to make Rodrigo laugh. I mended school uniforms myself and left little notes folded in pockets. I warned him in the kindest ways I could. Be careful with decisions you make quickly, son. But warnings from mothers are easy to file under bias. By the time the talk of managing finances became an open conversation, I had learned to move in other ways. I had an old friend who was now a lawyer, Eduardo Morales, who had watched my business grow along with me. He kept copies of things, not because I feared trouble, but because he liked order. When I began to notice an unsettling pattern, missed calls from suppliers, bills marked late that I had already paid, a polite voicemail from a bank saying, "We need to verify account status," I walked across town to Eduardo's office and told him, without drama, what I suspected. "Keep your cool," he said. "Eduardo has a voice like a ledger, flat, precise, trustworthy. Document everything. Make sure you have originals. Do not sign anything unusual. If someone asks to move money or to take title, we look carefully and we make a safe plan." He asked me questions I had not thought to ask. Who has access to your debit card? Who knows your passwords? Who has a letter from you granting authority over mail? When I told him about the signed power Rodrigo had put in her hands, he made a face and said, "Sometimes people sign because it is convenient. Sometimes people sign because they trust love more than paper." I did not want to be the woman who collects armsful of proof and brandishes them like weapons at every dinner. That was not my style.
My life had been about small, steady work. I did not crave theater, but I also had worked too hard to be casually erased. So I began to plan in the quiet way I have always worked. I gathered documents quietly, like one gathers quilts. Deeds to tiny buildings, the old ledger with rents written in a small backhand, a certificate for a plot in a community garden I had bought to preserve green space for the neighborhood children. If you could line up the pieces of a person's life on a table, each paper would be a story. I folded them and kept them in a box under the spare bed. Once a year, I took them to Eduardo for safekeeping. There is a thin moral thread that comes with secrecy. I think of it often. You hide things because you want to protect them. You hide things because you want a person to learn. But you also hide things because you are afraid. I was afraid of what wealth could do to a son who had not earned it, afraid that he would marry someone who would take it for granted, afraid that the warm work ethic I had given him would be replaced by entitlement. That fear shaped everything. When Valeria began to move from gentle suggestions into insistence, mentioning transfers, suggesting it just makes sense to consolidate, bringing up the idea that Rodrigo should formalize their finances, I stopped answering the phone in certain hours. I would not be baited into small arguments that made the family a court. I started to make arrangements that looked ordinary on the surface, name a property as joint for tax reasons, change an account to an online portal that required double verification. Eduardo helped me set up legal structures that would protect the assets without making them an announcement. I explained to Rodrigo, in a way that felt careful and slow, that the world was full of people who seemed obliging and who sometimes learned their kindness had a price. He nodded. He said he understood. He did not. If I had a simple confession, it would be this. I wanted to teach him, but I feared the lesson might harden into something cruel. That tension, the push and the doubt, followed us the same way a weather front follows a coast, inevitable and cooling. There were moments of tenderness in those years where nothing happened but the small human routines that save marriages and families. Valeria brought a newborn Mateo home, wrapped like a promise. I held him and felt his breath on my cheek, and for several months I thought perhaps the story would settle into a quiet domesticity. Valeria changed in ways that I judged charitably. She asked for recipes, came by to meet the women who worked at my shop, and sometimes she cried in quiet corners about how tired she was. Once, late at night when the house hummed with the refrigerator and the baby monitor, she knocked on my door and asked me how to boil beans so they wouldn't crack. I showed her, and we laughed at how simple things can feel like victory. But the pattern resumed.
The requests became demands, so gentle they looked like help. The conversations about making things official lost their transparency. She began to talk about security in a voice that suggested someone had told her the right words and she was practicing them. I watched the ledger, the small box under the bed, and felt the knot tighten, realizing that the moment I had kept hidden to teach a lesson might become the very thing someone else could use to rewrite me out of my life. The day she told everyone at Christmas that my card had been canceled, she did it with a tone of triumph that was almost invisible because the room was too polite to notice. It was a small, performative cruelty. To announce that a person's access to daily life had been taken away is to announce, softly, that they are not trusted. I have been humiliated in public before, the way people look at a woman with less when they think money is the border between respect and indifference. But humiliation combined with the cheer of a room is a new flavor. It felt like the world had decided to agree with her. That night, as the applause faded and the chandelier lights softened, I felt a certain calm settle into my bones. Not because I had a plan to humiliate her back. No, there is a cruelty I refuse to practice. But because I had been preparing for this, quietly, for years. It is a particular lonely kind of armor to own documents and proofs. It is not showy. It is slow. So I moved in the way my life had always moved, quietly and with intention. I picked up my napkin, set it down again, and put my hand on the wooden leg of the table, as if testing whether the house would still stand. Rodrigo's expression was a map of confusion, of sudden alarm. This was the man who had believed in the tidy goodness of his marriage. Valeria's smile, which had been put on like jewelry, faltered for the first time in months. People around the table began to look at me in a different way, the way you look at a rug you suspect hides a hole in the floor. There is strategy in small things. I waited for the right moment, the right breath. I could have launched into a speech about fairness. I could have demanded apologies. But these gestures would have fed a hunger in the room for drama rather than truth. So I took the simpler route. I made a phone call under the table to a man who had seen my handwriting on 1,000,000 receipts and who knew what the paper trail looked like. Eduardo answered in his blunt, steady way and said, "I'm on my way." I watched their faces while I waited for him to arrive, my nephew fiddling with his napkin, my sister's mouth forming a question she would not speak, Rodrigo's jaw slowly working as if he were chewing a truth he had not swallowed yet. I felt the house seem to hold its breath with me. There is a particular silence that comes right before the reveal of anything important, the kind that cleanses a room of small talk. It is not dramatic. It is necessary.
People cleared their throats, the baby stirred, and a waiter whose name I did not know came by with more bread, as if the evening were continuing. Outside the window the night pressed in, cold, clear, the kind of December that makes your nose sting, and inside the warm light made small jewels of the pieces on the table, the candlestick, the glass with condensation, the embroidered napkin my mother had given me. I felt old hands and steady history under my own skin, and I thought of Javier, who had always been the one to insist we pay attention to the smallest debts. I thought of Doña Estela's chuckle and the way she said, "Work will teach you more truth than fortune will." When the lawyer's car rolled up, he did not come in with fanfare. Eduardo entered like a man who carried facts rather than weapons. He had a worn leather folder with him. His shoes were scuffed from the city. He sat down as if the seat was a place he had occupied for a long time. He did not smile. He put the folder on the table, and the shape of it, the bulk, the edges, felt like the beginning of a story. Valeria's cheeks had a faint pink now, not from shame exactly, but from surprise. For months she had been arranging life as if it were an ambush that had already been won. That night, her statement about the card was supposed to be the final checkmate. It was small and efficient, and meant to line up every conversation that would follow. She had not expected resistance, because the resistance she had faced before had been softened or deferred by smiles and apologies. I breathe and tell this part slowly, because the way things moved after that would be sharp and complicated. People shift in an instant when they realize the map they have been following has a whole continent they did not know. You can sense the recalculation in their posture, the way the eyes flick for allies. It is not that I wanted to make anyone suffer. I wanted truth. I wanted my son to know what he was walking into. I wanted to protect Mateo. I wanted to reframe the idea of generosity into something that included work, responsibility, and hospitality, not entitlement. But I also knew that when the papers would be shown, deeds, accounts, receipts, this would not be the end of hurt. People who have been built into certain stories will resist being rewritten. I had been thinking of the evening in terms of a lesson. I had been thinking in terms of dignity. I had been thinking of rules and guardrails that would keep my grandson safe. That is why I prepared, not to wage war, but to set the record straight. As Eduardo opened his folder, the room leaned in without quite knowing what it was about to witness. The candles guttered.
A spoon fell from a woman's hand. Mateo looked up and reached for my finger. Rodrigo's face had become a landscape of questions that deserved answers.
He looked at the papers, then at me, then at Valeria, and I could see a man trying to reconcile the way two people he loved could be standing on opposite sides of a truth. I thought of the mornings he was small and I taught him to thread a needle, of the nights I sat up with him when he had the flu. I thought of the ways fatherlessness shaped me into someone who measures things in work rather than in words. In the quiet before things turned loud, before voices rose and choices had to be named, I felt a strange tenderness, not for the argument, but for the reckoning itself. Families are living things with the capacity to bruise and to mend. I had made choices that would bruise. I had not made them casually. I had made them because I wanted a different kind of future for the small boy who would one day be a man. Eduardo looked up. He had the kind of face that does not give away surprises. He placed the first paper on the table, and the light caught the top corner like a promise. Eduardo placed the first paper on the table, and the light picked out the corner like a small lighthouse in a storm. The page was a title deed, my name printed on it, and for a moment the room held a new language, pages, signatures, stamps. He set another document beside it, then another, receipts, old rent registers with tiny handwriting, a certificate from a bank tucked into an envelope. Each paper was a small, stubborn truth. He did not narrate like a storyteller. He read like someone reading a balance, calm and without flourish. "These are all in Amelia Diaz's name," he said, voice even. "The shop, the duplex on Buena Vista, the rental on 12th Street, the small plot we bought near the park. There are ledgers showing consistent rental income. There are invoices from suppliers and a certificate of deposits in a separate account under your trust." He was precise in the way that makes a person stop looking for an argument and start listening. Valeria's smile thinned into something brittle. She had expected applause, not proof. She had expected the room to rearrange around her announcement as if it were an inevitability, and instead the furniture of our lives refused to move. People turned their chairs, not toward her, but toward the stack of papers. Someone sucked air through her teeth. A child started to hum, the sound of normalcy trying to fill the sudden space. I could feel the heat in my hands, not fear exactly, more like the clean, focused heat of an oven that knows exactly how long to bake something. I did not grandstand. I let Eduardo speak. He pulled out a small ledger I had not seen in years and read a line aloud about a tenant who had paid for 2 months in advance, the handwriting looping and patient like mine. He opened a bank certificate and explained simply that some accounts required 2 signatures or a notarized transfer. He pointed to stamped dates and signatures, and where a document needed interpretation, he gave it without drama. Ownership is recorded. Transfers require your signature or written instruction. Rodrigo's face shifted in a way I recognized from his childhood, like someone reading a page and realizing half the lines had been written in invisible ink. He looked at Valeria, then at me. The air between them seemed to crackle with all the small things left unsaid over the years. Valeria tried to speak. Her voice was loud in the way of someone who had practiced being in charge. This is... She stumbled over the verbs. Her hands found the stem of her wine glass and held it like a prop. Rodrigo and I thought we were helping. This is surprising. Surprising. It was a tidy, small way to describe 30 years of steady work, the nights of counting coins under a pillow, the slow accumulation of a life. The word sat in the room like a pebble and made ripples. Rodrigo's first reaction was not rage, it was bewilderment. He looked as if he was seeing two versions of his life at once. The life he had arranged with Valeria's help, and the life that had been the quiet scaffolding beneath everything. I could see the gears in his head turning. He reached for comprehension like a hand reaching for a light switch. "Why would you hide it?" he asked. "Why small?" The question was not an accusation so much as an ache. "Why didn't you tell me?" I wanted to answer him with 100 small memories, the nights sewing until dawn, the first payment on that lot, the time he came home with pocket change and the pride he had in spending it. But none of those would fit inside the space that had opened between his two worlds. So I told him the truth in as few words as possible. "Because I wanted you to learn to stand on your feet," I said. "Because I wanted you to know how to earn something and not to expect the world to hand it to you." He looked at me, and in his expression I saw the man who had once learned to thread a needle with my help, who had once taken a job carrying paint cans so he could buy his first watch. He had been a son whose muscles had memories of work. He also had been a husband who had trusted a woman who promised to make life easier. He sat between those memories and the documents, and there was pain in that space. Valeria's mouth opened and closed. She walked around the table, slow and deliberate, as if the papers were rocks she might kick and displace. "You kept this from him, from your own son?" she said, and in the sentence there was both outrage and a thin attempt at moral posture. "You lied to him." It would have been easy to turn the room into an arena. People are hungry for sides. People pull scarves over their faces and pick a color to shout for. But I had never wanted spectacle. My life had been built on quiet labor. I had no appetite for a battle of words. Still, I understood that truth without context can sound like betrayal. Eduardo put down another piece of paper.
There are also records of funds set aside for education and for a trust for a grandchild, he said. These are managed in a way designed to preserve them for the next generation. Any transfer of title requires formal legal steps. None of the paperwork indicates an unauthorized transfer to a third party. The words were careful. They did one thing. They clarified that the documents themselves were the lawnmower that cut through rumor and left something practical behind. You could not play with facts the way you play with feelings. You could not cheer them into something else. Valeria's composure cracked then. Not loudly, but like a plate that splinters when you touch it. Her jaw tightened, and for a breath she looked like someone who had been caught with a script in her hand and no lines to perform. She reached for the excuse that had served her in public moments. I was trying to help him, but the room had already learned a new geometry. People were swiveling in their chairs to look at one another, as if they were recalculating loyalties. Rodrigo stood up so quickly the chair scraped. "You didn't tell me," he said to me, and then to Valeria, "and you—" He looked like a man whose foundation was giving away under his feet. "You set this up without talking to me?" "No," I said, and the word felt like a small sound of defense. "I didn't want you to grow into a life that thought everything came easy. I wanted you to be strong enough to build something for yourself. You decided that for me," he said, and for the first time I saw anger as the thin film over a deeper wound. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture of a man who had been forced to meet a truth he had not known to expect. "You lied to me, Mama. You lied to me my whole life." I did not deny it. I had been an architect of certain half-truths, noble, I thought, but still not the whole thing. "Yes," I said,
I chose to keep this from you. I chose to make my life look smaller. I thought it would help you learn. Maybe I was wrong." That admission did something quiet and difficult in the room. It did not excuse me. It did not absolve me. It made me human. People do not always respond well to the messy honesty of a choice confessed. Sometimes they want a clean villain and a clear victim. We were all gray. Valeria's face flushed. She leaned forward, voice sharpened to take a measure of control. "You used my husband as your experiment," she said. "You used him." Her words landed like blows because they contained a truth. Perhaps I had used him. My plan had been to teach him not to be entitled. In the attempt to shape the arc of his life, I had chosen secrecy. The question the room now raised was, at what cost? There was a hum of voices at the edges of the table, people trying to make sense, trying to negotiate where to stand. I felt Matteo, small and unaware, looking at the adults as if puzzled by their change in tone.
He reached for a bread roll, and we both smiled, a small human tether in a moment that risked unspooling. Rodrigo walked toward the window and stood with his hands pressed to the glass like someone holding on. He was young enough that his life could be rearranged, but old enough to know the feeling of betrayal. "I don't know which way to go," he said, voice near breaking. "Part of me thinks you made me into a man I admire. Part of me thinks you robbed me of choices." In that moment, I understood a truth I had never put into words. Teaching someone to be strong is not the same thing as deciding the architecture of their life without them. I had been both mother and engineer, and the plan had its blunt edges. I felt the weight of them and the knowledge that a lesson can become a cage if you do not let the person see the bars. Valeria left the room like a page ripped from a book, fast, flustered, unsure of where to land. She did not slam the door, she did not make a scene, she simply went. Her departure left a draft that moved the napkins on the table and the hair at the nape of someone's neck. People began to murmur, to stand, to hug, to move toward exits. The party was over in the way a play ends when the lights go out. After she left, the room became a slow, careful thing. Neighbors and family members drifted away with polite condolences, plates in hand. Rodrigo stayed. My sister came by and took his coat. Eduardo zipped his folder closed and sat for a moment, the pause of a man who had done his job and was now weighing the human mess left behind. When the last guest left, Rodrigo and I sat opposite each other in the quiet. The dining room had shrunk to the size of the two of us and the pile of papers on the table. Matteo slept with his head against my sister's shoulder in the living room, breathing shallow like a small bell. "Tell me everything," Rodrigo said, and he said it like someone who wanted to hear without interruption. I told him the story from the beginning again, not because he hadn't heard parts of it, but because there is a difference between knowing facts and hearing the heart behind them. I told him about Javier, about the nights I kept the machine going, about Doña Estela and her lessons, about the moments I had felt desperate and small, and the days that followed when things began to tip in the other direction. He listened in the way people listen when they are trying to reconcile two versions of love. He kept returning to three words: trust, choice, truth. "I feel like my life was a decision you made for me," he said finally, and his voice was softened with a grief I know well, one that comes when you realize your autobiography has an editor you didn't choose. "Maybe it was," I said. "Maybe that was wrong, but I did it because I believed I was protecting you. I was trying to teach you the muscle of work." I reached across the table, and he took my hand. The contact was not a solution. It was a human act.
In the days that followed, things unfolded in ways both predictable and surprising. Valeria sent messages that alternated between apologies and demands. She wrote that she felt humiliated, that she had acted with love for our family, that the way I had hidden things made her feel excluded. Rodrigo answered in fits and starts, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading for time. She called Eduardo's office and left a message that sounded like a tempered threat, less about law and more about public opinion. "You're not the only one who can call a lawyer," it said. It was the kind of thing people say to make an opponent hesitate. I let the calls come. Eduardo suggested we not respond to provocations and to let the facts do the work. That was his counsel. Keep calm, document, and do not widen the field for drama. It was good counsel. It is hard to make someone feel small when you keep your voice steady and your attention to details. Valeria's mother, Rebecca, sent a message that surprised me. She asked to meet. Her tone was not defensive. It was small and tentative, tinged with a sorrow that seems older than a single argument. We met at a small cafe near the park. She was smaller than I had imagined, her shoulders rounded as if the weight of years had settled there. She did not come to accuse. She came with a paper bag and a nervous smile. "I thought she was doing what was right," Rebecca said, folding and unfolding her napkin like someone counting nets. "But I can see now that she crossed a line. I'm sorry you had to—" She stopped, searching for words. "I'm sorry." She did not come to take sides. She came to offer an olive branch, and in the following weeks she became a quiet ally in a way that surprised us both. She talked to her daughter in ways that made the difference, a mother-to-daughter plea to see a counselor, a request to slow down and listen. It is one thing to be an antagonist in public, and another to be your child's mother in private. Rebecca began to do something I recognized. She began to separate what was humane from what was performative. Valeria agreed to see a therapist, partly because she wanted to salvage her marriage, and partly because her mother asked. The sessions were not a magic bullet. Therapy asks people to sit with their shame in ways that are both humbling and demanding. She began to talk about the hunger she had felt, the way she had learned to measure success by appearance, by the quality of shoes and the click of heels. She told a woman who listened without judgment that she had worried her whole life she would never be secure. In therapy, she learned that when you are afraid, you may grab at control in ways that harm others. There were practical moves, too. Valeria's early threats of litigation were more noise than force. Eduardo reassured us that the documents in order and the accounts set up would be hard to challenge without cooperation. We did not model our months on headlines.
We modeled them on quiet daily tasks, revising the will, updating the trust documents so they were even clearer, naming Eduardo and another trustee to oversee the funds for Mateo's education. We set aside a small sum for Valeria to clear certain debts, with the condition that she complete counseling and that the funds be administered directly to creditors. It was a practical mercy, help with accountability, not a blank check to escape responsibility. Rodrigo and Valeria began couples therapy too for a while. It did not fix every broken thing, but it forced conversations that had been easy to avoid. In those sessions, they talked about communication, about power, about what it meant to combine families. Some conversations were ugly, some were tender. Eventually, their marriage dissolved, not as a scandal, but as a painful recognition that two people could love in ways that were breaking rather than building. They separated with a mixture of bitterness and relief. "We tried," Rodrigo said to me once, voice raw. He moved back into his old room for a while, and we cooked dinners and sat at the small kitchen table sewing or doing a small mending job.
The shop hummed on, and women came to learn how to stitch and how to keep accounts. Valeria and I never had the kind of public reconciliation that movies love. We had a moment later when she came by the shop to pick up a dress she had bought before everything imploded. She looked at me in a quiet way I had not seen, and she said, "I'm sorry." It was not enough for everything, but it was something. Rebecca stood by her side, and there was a sense that parenthood had opened a fissure small enough for repair talk to begin. The practical rebuilding of family life involved new boundaries. I revised my will and made clearer plans for how assets would be used to support education and entrepreneurship. I drafted the language with Eduardo so that the resources I had accumulated would not accidentally be manipulated by someone acting in haste or out of resentment. I did not close the door on forgiveness, but I wanted a system that required accountability. One of the outcomes that surprised me was how many women began to come to the shop seeking not only stitches but advice. It seems my little quiet life had been a kind of tutorial for others. Women came, some widowed, some separated, some just starting out, and they sat where I had sat years ago with Doña Estela, learning how to measure not only fabric but opportunity. I began to run small workshops on bookkeeping for women who made a living with their hands. We pooled resources to help one another in times of emergency. That small community became the seed for something larger. With Eduardo's help and the counsel of a few trusted friends, I founded a small foundation, not flashy, a modest thing that provided micro-grants and training to women like me who wanted to start businesses.
We called it La Aguja, the needle, because everything I had learned began with the small hole a needle makes and the work that can follow. The foundation offered a space where women could learn to keep ledgers, negotiate with suppliers, price their work fairly, and save small sums that might compound into security. It was my answer to a private plan becoming public service. I did not want my life to be a secret anymore. I wanted it to be a resource. Rodrigo eventually moved into a small house I transferred to him. Not a gift without conditions, but a property given with the expectation that he would continue to work and provide for Mateo in ways that valued labor and responsibility. The transfer included stipulations set up by Eduardo, funds earmarked for Mateo's education, an expectation that the house not simply be sold off without safeguarding the interests of the child. To some, this might sound controlling. To me, it was prudence. The same prudence I had practiced by buying in small increments, by keeping records, by ensuring that work and dignity were linked. Time, as it always does, softened edges. Rodrigo and I learned new ways to speak. He came more often to the shop and sat beside the women who were learning and taught Mateo to hold a needle the way I had taught him to hold a pencil. He would take shifts at the community table, helping a young woman learn how to price a blouse. In watching him, I saw that the lesson had not been lost. He still honored work, but now he held his mother's choices with more scrutiny and less blind faith. He forgave in ways that looked like work, repairing fences and showing up. Valeria moved away eventually, not in sudden exile, but in the quiet way some people move to start again. She left with Mateo's father's blessing to see what she might build on her own. The divorce was, in the months that followed, a legal filing and a personal reckoning. I will not pretend every wound healed quickly. They didn't. But over time, the loud, sensational things on the surface gave way to quieter repairs. Valeria engaged in therapy, and she began to work on the parts of herself that had reached for control through public performance. Rebecca visited the shop sometimes, bringing empanadas and a soft apology that had learned to be patient. There were people who criticized me publicly for what they called secrecy,
for denying a son the truth of his inheritance. There were others who admired the way I had protected my family from entitlement. I did not try to win public opinion. I had never been good at that. What I did try to do was to keep my life aligned with the values that had sustained me: work, dignity, and the willingness to help the next woman at the sewing table. With Eduardo's guidance, we also reorganized certain holdings into clearer instruments designed to preserve resources for education and for the foundation.
We made sure that the money would be used for its intended purpose and that the process required transparent oversight. The mechanics of that are dull and particular: trustees, oversight boards, periodic reviews, but they served a purpose: to make sure that a life earned did not slip away through confusion or haste. There were hard, tender moments through all of this. I remember once, months after the Christmas night, sitting at the old Singer with Mateo beside me. He was small, fingers fumbling with thread, looking at the machine like it might be a living thing. Rodrigo stood in the doorway and watched us. For a time, none of us spoke, the kind of silence that is full of living. Then I showed Mateo how to knot the thread, and he laughed when the knot slipped, and Rodrigo came in and tightened the bobbin, and for a breath the years of discord folded into something simpler. All these years later, I still wonder about choices. Would I hide my hard-won life again? I cannot answer that in a single way. There were nights when the weight of my decision felt like iron. There were other nights when I watched Rodrigo stand after he had paid his own bills, when I saw him teach a neighbor's boy how to change a tire, and I felt that my decision had been a strange kind of gift. If I had to name the lesson in the way people like tidy endings, I would say this: dignity matters more than being right. I wanted Rodrigo to be a man who could stand on his own. I wanted a life for Mateo that did not hang on someone else's projection. I also learned the hard way that secrets, however well-intentioned, become a different kind of danger when they are wielded by others. It takes courage to keep a life private. It takes even more courage to reveal it when reveal is the only way to protect what you love. There were things I did not control. Some relationships did not return to old shapes. Some people would always look at me differently now. But there was also growth. Rodrigo learning to ask questions instead of assuming. Valeria learning to sit with things she cannot control. Rebecca learning to speak up before a situation escalated. In the years that followed, the foundation grew slow and steady. We helped dozens of women open micro-businesses, provided loans that were small and repayable, and taught bookkeeping in a room with sun and a kettle that whistled like a metronome. We held sewing nights where grandchildren ran around the legs of chairs, and the women laughed and argued about the best way to press a seam. I watched careers begin that would not have been possible if one person had kept everything under a closed roof. The legacy I thought I was building was not the papers under the spare bed. It was the habit of doing things with care. It was the small rituals, paying a bill on time, writing a receipt, teaching a child to stoop and mend a torn pocket and see it as work worthy of respect. Those were the things that outlived the drama. That was the seed I wanted to plant. People sometimes ask me now, years later, if I regret the Christmas night. They ask it like it is a neat equation: one humiliation, one reveal, one life. I tell them the truth. I regret the ways my secrecy caused pain. I do not regret the principle that guided me, that I wanted my son and my grandson to value work, to understand how to steward money, to have the dignity of earning. I cannot promise the path was the only right one. All I can say is that it was the path I had the courage to walk. I have less appetite for theatrical victories now. I have more appetite for the steady, ordinary work of teaching other women how to count their stitches and their days. When I teach Mateo to thread the needle, I tell him that a stitch holds things together, seams reinforce, and mending is an act of love. He takes his small hands and works the thread, and sometimes it falls apart. We fix it again. When people ask what to do if they find themselves in a family caught between secrets and control, I tell them what I learned to do. Gather facts, seek counsel you trust, and remember that mercy can be practical. Help given without accountability can become a new kind of harm. Help given with compassion and clear expectations can be the lever that lifts someone into long-term stability. There is a quiet joy in watching those who were once naive about money become wise. It is not a joy of triumph, it is a joy of seeing people learn. Rodrigo learned, and he taught others. Valeria learned in her own complicated way, and she set about rebuilding a life that was less about appearances and more about substance. Rebecca learned to speak up earlier. I learned that truth, when handled with care, can repair more than it breaks. One winter afternoon, not long ago, I looked out of my kitchen window at the street where children played. A woman from the foundation came to borrow my sewing machine for a lesson. I packed a small lunch, we walked to the community room, and we spent the afternoon teaching, laughing, and mending. Mateo sat beside me, his small hands steady. Rodrigo knocked on the door at the end of the day and brought home coffee. There were no grand gestures. There was the simple, steady presence of family. If my story does anything for you, I hope it offers two things: the courage to protect what you've built and the willingness to be accountable with the help you give. Secrets can be shields, but they can also be cages. Choose carefully. Hold fast to dignity. Teach the next generation not only how to earn, but how to steward. If my confession resonated with you, if you've ever felt the sting of being excluded or the burden of protecting a life you built, please share your story below. Tell me how you've set boundaries or how you learned to balance protection with honesty. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need it.
And if you are able, consider supporting local programs that teach financial literacy and entrepreneurship to women. Small acts can grow into lives of dignity and security.